Welcome to this evening of where we're having a webinar on the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. We've already had some interesting issues with Jack in the Galilee, having a power outage, and we're hoping and praying, that his power remains with us for over the next hour or so. There's a very good relationship between churches together in Britain and Ireland and the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. It's a programme that's run through the World Council of Churches, and we are privileged to play our part in supporting the work that is especially focused through the Friends, through the Quakers in the UK. Tonight we've got two presenters, and that's Jack Munayer and Matt Cowling, who are working or have worked with EAPPI, with the programme, and they're going to speak to us in a moment, introduce themselves. And the thing I would say before we begin, that this is a topic, the Middle East is a topic that brings forward very big responses, and I would ask everyone in their questioning, in their question and answer session, to be respectful and to ask questions that are appropriate. I'm going to ask Jack and Matt if they just very briefly introduce themselves in sort of 10 or 15 seconds, just say who they are and where they're from.
Hello everyone, I'm Jack Munayer. I'm from Jerusalem originally, and I'm the local program coordinator for the EAPPI program.
Thanks, Jack. And Matt?
Thanks very much, Bob. Yes, my name's Matt. I was an ecumenical accompanier earlier this year. I'm in Bedfordshire, and yeah, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, we're going to have a great evening, and the guys are going to make some presentations, and I hope certainly by 7:30 that we will have lots of time for question and answer, and I will be moderating that session and putting the questions through to Jack and to Matt. So Jack, I think you're going to go first with your presentation, so please God, that the power stays with you in every sense of the word, and that we're able to see your excellent presentation, please.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to be answering basically two questions about the EAPPI program. The first is, why do we need a program like EAPPI in Israel and the Palestinian territories in the first place? And then what are the basics that EAPPI does? What does EAPPI do? And the context that we're speaking of is the context of a land that more or less throughout territorial disputes and conflicts should have ended up looking a little bit like this between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, the Israeli being in dark green and the Palestinian territories sort of meant to be in orange. This is what a lot of people refer to as a two-state solution. However, in 1967, Israel conquered and occupied the orange territories, which is why we refer to them as the occupied Palestinian territories. So just before we jump forward to why we need EAs on the ground, it's important that we ask the question, well, what is an occupation? And an occupation is the effective control by asserting ruling power over a territory which is not under its formal sovereignty. And oftentimes when an occupation sets out, it sets out with a clear set of goals that it is meant to achieve. So for example, in the picture below, the United States, along with other countries, including the United Kingdom, invaded and occupied Iraq in order to find allegedly weapons of mass destruction. So this is a good example of what a military occupation looks like. However, it's not quite clear in the Palestinian territories. And this is for this reason. A military occupation is meant to be temporary. In our situation, that hasn't been the case. It is generally speaking a legal method in order to achieve goals. It is administered by a military entity. It is meant to protect the rights and laws of the people that are being occupied. and it cannot change the status of the land that it is occupying. So then the question is, well, are the Palestinian territories occupied under international law? And there are 25 Security Council resolutions which reiterate the fact that these territories are indeed occupied. We also have the International Court of Justice, the ICJ advisory opinion on the wall, which states that this land is occupied. So while technically they are occupied, the reality is very different. And in EAPPI, we will oftentimes refer to the situation as not just an occupation, but a de facto annexation. And we'll cover that again in a little bit. The reason why we say it's not really occupied is because of settlements. Settlements are Israeli towns and enclaves that are dotted all across the West Bank territory. And this is illegal under international law. And as of right now, there's over 500,000 settlers living inside the West Bank. This is a map which spreads out the settlement areas. So the blue areas are officially sort of recognized by the State of Israel settlement outpost, and the purple ones are unrecognized. And this is where the more or less 500,000 people live. And this creates a lot of issues, as this population is living right next to the Palestinian population. And it's sort of an obstacle to have one cohesive future Palestinian state with so many settlements present. Settlements will oftentimes then restrict the Palestinian population with checkpoints. Most of the checkpoints in the West Bank restrict Palestinians from accessing other Palestinian territory, but there are also checkpoints which restrict Palestinians from accessing Israel. And this creates quite a few human rights issues. Secondly, there are demolitions and property confiscation all across the West Bank, as Palestinians in over 2/3 of the West Bank must acquire Israeli permission in order to build. 98.4% of these permissions are rejected by the Israeli authorities. Palestinians build anyway, and oftentimes face demolitions and confiscations. Demolitions are also used as collective punishment against the population when there are clashes between Israelis and Palestinians. We also see the confiscation of medical facilities, whether they be tents or otherwise. The picture you see right now is the confiscation of a medical tent in the Jordan Valley that was meant to serve particularly the rural population, the rural Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley, who have access to very little healthcare. And this confiscation happened during the Corona pandemic. So it's very difficult for Palestinians to have access to their basic rights and needs in this situation. Furthermore, in some of the settlements, there's quite a lot of settler harassment of the Palestinian population. This is oftentimes done under the protection of the Israeli military, as this photo indicates, where settlers will come and disturb Palestinians or attack Palestinians who are taking their sheep to graze in fields, who are picking olives, as is happening right now across all of the West Bank at this time of year. If Palestinian children are on their way to school, oftentimes you might have settler harassment. And Palestinians don't really have a remedy to this issue. In other words, they can't simply call the police because Palestinian police can't interfere in these situations. They can't call a Palestinian military, as there is none. And oftentimes when they call the Israeli military, it does not help, as they are perpetrators oftentimes themselves. Therefore, Palestinians feel very much choked without solutions when they face this type of harassment. We also have oftentimes violent military and police harassment of Palestinians across the West Bank, where again, any attempt to try and find a remedy to an injustice that has taken place is met with very little success through the Israeli court system and otherwise. And this sort of brings us to the situation where the local Palestinian church asked, what can we do when we are facing this type of situation, when both Palestinian Christians and Muslims are coming to the church and saying, can you do something about this type of harassment and violation of human rights? And so the heads of churches, the Palestinian heads of churches, came together along with the World Council of Churches and basically said, let's come up with a response that is both based in human rights and international law, but is also biblical. And this model was taken as Jesus as an accompanier. And when we read through the New Testament, we see that Jesus accompanied people where they were in their life. He accompanied people that he met as they were going through their daily struggles. He walked shoulder to shoulder with people, whether it was lepers or whether it was the Samaritan woman. Jesus most often accompanied the poor and marginalized. And in this way, Jesus showed solidarity with humanity. Therefore, the EAPPI program is built very much on this, where we try and bring internationals who can walk shoulder to shoulder with vulnerable populations and be in solidarity with them and affirm their humanity. So what do EAs do based on this model? Well, as I mentioned, the checkpoints are a major issue for human rights violations, and EAs, or Ecumenical Accompaniers, will monitor checkpoints to see how soldiers are treating people as they try to go through. And you can see the EA here in the corner, just watching and observing. And what a lot of the local population reported is that if you had an international accompanier present, the soldier would oftentimes change his behavior and treat people perhaps slightly better, perhaps will let them go through a bit quicker rather than arbitrarily stalling them. And so we have EAs monitoring major checkpoints all across the West Bank. Some of the worst checkpoints that we have will oftentimes reject people because their shoes are too white, or they have too many sandwiches in their bag, or as one of the cases that we recorded at the end of last year was a man had too many daughters, and then he was rejected from going through the checkpoint. So EAs will oftentimes monitor the checkpoint. And this success that we had then expanded to other areas. There's also school runs where ecumenical accompaniers will go with children through checkpoints where their parents might not be allowed to or may not be able to because they have work in other areas. And according to our research with the people that we accompany, boys recorded 50% less violent encounters with soldiers and settlers, or harassment, when they had an EA present, and girls recorded 100% less harassment when an EA was present. Sometimes they will be in urban structures like this, but sometimes EAs will accompany children in rural areas where children have to walk very far in order to access the closest school, oftentimes followed by military personnel, which is why we try and have EAs present to document and make sure that no harassment takes place. EAs will also accompany shepherds and agricultural workers as they try and work with their livelihood. And this time of year is particularly sensitive with the olive harvest, which is oftentimes met with severe harassment by settlers. So EAs will oftentimes attempt to be there to document and be a deterrent for settlers to harass. A lot of the information that we acquire through EAs is documented in a database and is shared with stakeholders such as the United Nations and others, who can then advocate and use their statistics to shed light on what goes on under the occupation. We also support the local church and peace activists, whether they be Israeli, Palestinian, international, or otherwise. EAs will also have extensive time to spend with Israeli partners to try and learn as much as possible about the Israeli population, the Israeli side, whether this be with the ultra-Orthodox community, with national religious activists, so that when they come home, they have as broad a picture as possible about the different types of populations and opinions that we have here in Israel and Palestine. Perhaps the most important thing that an ecumenical accompanier does is advocate for a just peace. Through the experiences that they have here, the things that they witness and document, they're able to carry people's stories and voices back to their home countries in a way that perhaps those voices would not normally reach through the mainstream media. Therefore, the biggest change that we aim for in the long run is advocating for the human rights, for the rights of vulnerable Palestinian communities, and for a just peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. So just some final thoughts. The EA's first-hand accounts are unique and give insights to the lived experience of people living under occupation. If we want to advocate for a just and peaceful solution, we need to remember the human rights of the people in this land. And if those are not upheld in whatever deal of the century or peace agreement that is made at the high political end, we won't have a real just peace. And lastly, vulnerable Palestinian communities today are under the threat of annexation. Now, there was an announcement by the Israeli government that they were planning on annexing the Jordan Valley, which would have been a huge segment of the West Bank, in July. That didn't follow through for a variety of different reasons, which we can go into later. But annexation is still going on today. Palestinians are continuing to lose land. New settlement outposts are appearing on a regular basis with the absence of international protective presence. And there is a real concern that soon any sense of two-state peaceful solution will no longer be possible if Palestinians are annexed into some form of sub-state or under the Israeli authority. Matt is going to share more about this, I'm sure, about his experience of not only witnessing human rights violations and accompanying the Palestinian population, but also what does creeping annexation look like? What does a de facto annexation, how does that impact the everyday sort of person in the occupied Palestinian territories? So I'll stop here and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Jack. You know, that was an excellent presentation. Lots of power, very strong images, as well as, you know, strong sentiments and strong words. So thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to ask Matt to build on that very solid foundation that Jack has provided. So over to you, Jack. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Bob. I hope everyone can see my screen okay like that with my cursor on the right. It's brilliant. Okay, so thanks very much, Jack. Yes, so EA's Witness Life Under Occupation. We engage with local Palestinians and Israelis to urge for a just peace. And we do presentations like this in order to change the international community's involvement in the conflict and urge them to act against injustice in the region. Now, I was an ecumenical accompanier in January to March this year, based in a place called Tulkarem, which is in the north of the West Bank. You can just see my cursor on the right here. Now, my presentation is going to demonstrate what EAs do and continue to talk about de facto annexation and the dangers that presents people in the region. Now, the West Bank is actually pretty small. This is it on superimposed onto a map of the UK. So just coming out of London, just a few hours up, perhaps up the A1, and you'll get to Peterborough. So only a few hours. That gives you a sense of how big it is. Now, why does this matter to us? Now, simply, there are vulnerable communities that need our support more than ever right now. And as you'll see, this is not only an ongoing issue, but something that has been made all the much worse by the coronavirus pandemic. So it's very urgent we act now. One of the people that I spoke to was a man called Taisir. Like millions and millions of people around the world, Taisir was forced to stay inside during the coronavirus pandemic. However, Taisir isn't just locked down because of coronavirus, but something else too. Something else that has been affecting him, in fact, for several years. Speaking to Taisir in February, he said to me, "Only God can help me now." Taisir has 7 children and a wife at home, but instead he's forced to stay here. This is his place of work. This is a place for animals. He's a farmer. The building on the left-hand side, you can see my cursor behind the fence, was destroyed by illegal Israeli settlers. Now, these are Israeli civilians that live inside the West Bank. This was destroyed last year in July. Taisir rebuilt it, only to be destroyed again by the same group of individuals that live in the settlement behind him, Lashem. Taisir's son is with him too, and his wife brings them both food regularly. He tells me that he's locked down not just because of the pandemic, but 24/7 in fear the illegal settlers will come, destroy everything, steal his land, because they have told him that in fact it's theirs to take. Now we can see here, he had around 800 meters squared for his animals. A fence was built through. Now he has around 60 meters squared for his sheep. And this is equated to around £70,000 worth of income lost. Now, Jack has touched on this, but what and where are legal settlements? Now, in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, winning territory in the Six-Day War from Jordan, since then, large numbers of Israeli civilians have moved into the West Bank and established illegal settlements. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side. Now, this land is intended to make up the future of the state of Palestine. And around, I believe in 2019, there's around 132 settlements, covering around 40% of the land of the West Bank. Now, who are settlers exactly? Well, as Jack said, there's over 500,000 illegal settlers living inside the West Bank. Now, the majority of these settlers are seeking a better quality of life and move to the West Bank because of the advantages inside the West Bank over Israel. This movement of Israeli civilians has been facilitated with the political, military, and financial support of the Israeli government. So, for example, housing has often been subsidized by the government, education, as well as businesses receiving income tax breaks. This is a man on the photo of the left, a man called Abu Omar, who's very keen to show me a new settlement development near his home. Now, why does this matter? Why am I talking about illegal settlements and so on? Now, the majority of settlers do not cause harm or direct violence to Palestinians or Palestinian property. There are a number of settlers who are religious nationalists, believing that God promised them the greater land of Israel and see it their duty to live in it in these settlements. Lashem, the one behind Taisir's farm, is a religious nationalist settlement. Now, a small number of settlers do perpetrate violence against Palestinians, damaging land, persons, and their property. And you can see here on the right-hand side, from 2009 and 2018, the UN recorded nearly 3,000 incidents of violence. And on the left here, you can see a heat map of where those were taking place. Now, fearing violence against him and his property, Taisir is forced to stay in these current conditions. You can see here, he has beds. On the right-hand side, he's got a television in there because he's in there all the time. It's got a fire because it was very cold when I was there in February. And at the back there, you can see myself and my team, as he was showing me his animals. This is where, you know, his animals are brought here, they live, they slaughter, and he feels that if he leaves, this will be taken away from him as his livelihood. And this is another view. So what has this got to do with occupation? Surely you could say this is a domestic matter between settlers and Palestinians, perhaps. Well, the answer is that the Israeli military do not always deploy in advance to protect Palestinians from settler violence, whereas settlers are often heavily protected. And this is very important because under international law, Israel, as the occupying power, has extensive obligations. Now, to unpack that further, I turn more towards international law. Protected persons are entitled in all circumstances to be humanely treated and shall be protected, especially against all acts of violence or threats. And this is Article 27 of the 4th Geneva Convention, 1949, which was adopted by the international community to limit the human suffering in times of armed conflict. And this is a key source or part of international humanitarian law, otherwise known as the laws of armed conflict, which applies in situations of occupation. So what do we gather from this article? Simply that Palestinians are protected persons living under occupation, and therefore Israel must administer the West Bank for the benefit of the local protected population and have responsibility of ensuring law and order. Okay, so that's harassment, violence, and so on. But what about settlements? What does international law say about settlements? The occupying power should not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, as Article 49. This simply means that settlements are prohibited. So why is this happening? How is the Israeli government continuing to do this? Now, Jack has touched on this, and I'll expand on this a little bit further. Now, on a political level, the Israeli government often refers to occupied West Bank, or to the West Bank, as disputed territory. Now, on a political level, and therefore that humanitarian law does not apply. So therefore, settlements are legal. Now, the reason this political rhetoric is used is that they argued that the disputed territories, when they were seized from Jordan in the 1967 war, were never actually recognized as the legal sovereignty or the supreme power. So essentially, Jordan never had it, so Israel never really occupied it. This is, however, the vast international community disagree with this. And you can look to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, as Jack mentioned. The UK government, the Irish government, and the EU all disagree that with this claim. They believe that humanitarian law does apply and that this is a situation of occupation. Now, what is important is that the Israeli government is often accused of using the disputed territories argument in order to legitimate and further the settlement expansion since 1967. And this is one reason why we can describe it as a de facto annexation. Okay, what does annexation mean? So annexation is the acquisition of territory through the use of force, whether realized in practice and in fact, or known as de facto, or through the formal extension of authority by law, so de jure. Now, both are strictly prohibited under international law. And now, as Jack said, earlier this year, the Israeli coalition government announced plans to formally annex large parts of the occupied West Bank. This would have meant displacing around 50,000 Palestinians, or 1/3 of the land of the West Bank. This was met with opposition around the world, but was backed by the US. Now, this didn't happen from mid-August, and I think we can talk about this a bit later, as there was a peace deal or a normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So the annexation plans were called off. So great, there's no annexation. Unfortunately, that's not the answer. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur has recently said that, according to the UN, Israel has continuously entrenched its de facto annexation of the West Bank by imposing intentionally irreversible changes to occupied territory prescribed by international humanitarian law. So this is the settlements as a de facto annexation. Israel has not declared an official annexation, but the very fact that the settlements are on the ground are creating a situation of annexation. So this is strictly, if it is so strictly prohibited, how is this happening exactly? Now, as Jack mentioned, he explained what an occupation is. So on the left, we have characteristics of an occupation, and on the right, annexation. Essentially, this is the longest military occupation in history. So it's such a long occupation that the reality is far from the textbook definition of occupation. Now, if you look to the left, I did say before that on a political level, the Israeli government claimed that they are disputed, that international humanitarian law doesn't apply. But when we look on a legal level, when you look at what the Israeli Supreme Court is doing, they do apply humanitarian law because it's an occupation. So humanitarian law applies because occupation is a legal thing. Now, if you direct your attention to the right, this occupation has been going on for so long. It's a situation which has been described as indefinite, that it has the characteristics of a de facto annexation. So permanency, illegality, and a population under a new state's law. Okay, so what effect does this have on Palestinians? What is the result of this? For people like Taysir, the creeping de facto annexation results living in a dual legal system. On one hand, he is under military rule, under humanitarian law, supposedly temporary and legal. But on the other hand, this looks increasingly more like a de facto annexation day to day. That by the extension and application of Israeli law to the West Bank, that gives privileged legal treatment to settlers. So not only this is a dual legal system, but a discriminatory legal regime in which illegal settlers have an increased level of protection than Palestinians. Now, not all Israelis by no means agree with their government, not at all. There have been protests against the annexation throughout the year which continue to this day, as well as multiple human rights organizations inside Israel that are working against the occupation and the de facto annexation and any further formal annexation in the future. For example, as an ecumenical accompanier, we accompany human rights groups such as the Women in Black, who march every Friday to end the occupation. I also got to accompany B'Tselem, an Israeli peace organization, with the monitoring of human rights violations, who look into settler harassment, and have cited in the past that the Israeli authorities do not do enough to prevent Israeli settlers from attacking Palestinians, their property and their lands. So as Jack went into this, we report on violations of international law and offer protective presence, but we also give advocacy presentations like this to raise awareness. We raise awareness and we tell the stories of people like Taysir to really show the reality of big, lofty legal and political narratives like occupation and annexation and humanitarian law, to show what the reality really is like on the guiding principles of principled impartiality, which is not taking sides for either Palestinians or Israelis, but really using humanitarian law and human rights as the benchmark. EAs come back from the West Bank and Israel, and they tell these stories, but they also campaign. So earlier this year, we had the No to Annexation campaign, which had a total reach of over 270,000 people, which is probably an underestimate apparently. And this saw EAs contacting their political representatives, faith leaders, doing social media, all of those things. Now, coming back to Taysir, coming back to the coronavirus pandemic, you would have thought perhaps that things maybe would have quietened down. But at the start of the pandemic restrictions, the UN saw a nearly 80% increase in settler-related violence compared to the start of 2020. So this is by all means not going away for Palestinians living in the West Bank. So as I draw to an end, we need urgent action. There are things that we can all do to help EAPPI and to help EAs at the moment. So I will share this in the chat, but we encourage you to follow the EAPPI UK and Ireland on social media, sign up to the mailing list so you can find out actions that you can take, and look out for the upcoming Olive Harvest campaign that will be coming out soon. Thank you very much.
Matt, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much indeed, very clear, and thank you, Jack, also for yours. Two extremely powerful and excellent presentations, and I'm now looking for you who are the audience participating in this webinar to send in your questions either on the Q&A or directly into the system where you are. I'm going to begin with an easy one just to get the conversation started. From someone who's applied to be an ecumenical accompanier in Israel Palestine in 2021, and they're asking Jack, when do you hope to get things get the program running again?
It's a good question because a lot of the local community are asking us the same question. The truth is that we don't know for sure. This pandemic is unpredictable, and we did not expect Israel to be the first country to enter a second lockdown because of what has largely been a mishandling of the pandemic. So we do hope to have the possibility of internationals coming back in after the winter, where we see how the virus reacts and how the population reacts to the pandemic over the winter period. And so we're hoping for a restart this coming spring, but we have to adjust to these events just like everyone else has, and wait and see what happens.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get into some of the more serious issues. I have a question. What is it that allows the Israeli government to flout international law, and how might that be changed? I guess, you know, that Jack, you know, if you have a first go at that, then I'll ask Matt just to briefly add any comments he has.
Well, like any legal system, if you have laws that are not enforced, they're not going to be followed. And although international law is tricky when it comes to enforcement, there is the possibility of enforcing it through a coalition of international pressure. And so far, there hasn't been any serious attempts by states, or certainly in the West, to have these laws enforced. And so I think our hope is that to try and educate people coming from all over the world who come from countries that can really have a voice at the table when it comes to this type of international pressure, to change that, so that they do take steps to try and enforce the law and to promote a peaceful solution. I think oftentimes there's a misconception that this conflict is between two peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, but this is not the case. There are three parties to this conflict: Israelis, Palestinians, and the international community that have allowed the situation to happen, or have oftentimes actively participated. Very briefly, we also know that there are certain countries that really call the shots when it comes to world politics, or at least have a stronger voice than others, mainly the US, but certainly countries like the UK, international bodies like the EU. And so we have an imbalance of power here when it comes to political allies. Therefore, the voice of EAPPI and others that advocate for international law is particularly important, because if you do not follow international law in this situation, you risk the sort of international law becoming irrelevant across the world, and that would be incredibly dangerous.
Okay, thank you for that. Matt, just very briefly, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think from my experience, seeing international law being flouted in the way the question is, as Jack said, it is an unbalanced conflict. I mean, international law is a toolbox, but unless it is enforced, it can be flouted, basically. And I believe that we need to encourage the international community and remind them that we all have the states have a legal duty to recognize this situation if it is illegal. So yeah, that would be my answer. I've seen how unbalanced it can be, and therefore international law without enforcement and accountability can be violated.
Okay, thanks. You know, here's a question that that adds to the complexity. You know, it's clearly from a Christian who's asking, Israel claims in all sincerity that the land was promised to them by God, thus they have an indisputable right to the land. And they quote extensively from the Old Testament, Bible, and other Jewish texts to support this claim. How do you, as accompaniers, respond to that kind of view of Scripture? Matt, do you want to say something to start off with, just briefly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my response to that would be, as an ecumenical accompanier, that it seems to me that borders aren't established by religious texts at the moment. And Israel's right to exist has been recognised by the international community, and also for the Palestinian state to be created. That would probably be my response to that.
Good. Okay, thank you very much for that. Matt, Jack, do you want to add anything briefly? And there's lots of questions coming in.
Yes, I don't think that any system that we have at the moment that allows one group of people to impose their religious interpretation over another is an effective way of living at peace. But I would also say that there's a bit of a problem in the question, because within Judaism, there isn't an understanding that this is the correct interpretation. It's widely disputed for religious Jews as well. Therefore, there are many Jews who do not agree that that the land is given to, or at least that the establishment of the state of Israel has been in accordance to their religious beliefs.
Thanks. And certainly these aren't questions that you can, address in any with any seriousness, in a short webinar. What is the COVID situation like in the West Bank and Gaza? Jack first, and then I know that Matt's been over in the West Bank recently, so I'll come back to you, Matt. But Jack, what's the COVID situation like?
I'll start with Gaza. Gaza has very few cases because it is essentially an open-air prison. Very few people go in and very few people come out. And so in a sense, it's been more protected from the spread of the virus. There have been a few cases, but not a serious spread. In the West Bank, it's slightly different because first of all, there were many tourists who were able to access certain areas of the West Bank, and many Palestinians that work on the Israeli side. However, the COVID-19 situation in its sort of severity changes from area to area in the West Bank. As we talked about in this presentation, checkpoints and other physical restrictions really sort of create isolated areas across the West Bank. So a city like Hebron has the majority of coronavirus cases in the West Bank. A lot of the, unfortunately, restrictions were not followed, but also a lot of the medical assistance that is available to Palestinians is quite weak. And so they haven't been able to handle the situation the same way that other countries have. People are more concerned at the moment about their livelihood. This is the main concern that we hear from Palestinians who, generally speaking, have a very, very low income. So the cases are dropping in the West Bank, but they remain sort of in hotspots, particularly in Hebron and the Nablus area.
Yeah, and Hebron is a difficult enough place without having COVID on top of it. It's just, absolute disaster, isn't it? Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would add obviously Jack being in Israel currently, he obviously knows the current COVID situation, but so we left the West Bank and we flew back from Tel Aviv airport towards the end of March, so just before the UK was going into lockdown, and in the week perhaps or so running up to that, before we left, the feeling that coronavirus was spreading, it was quite bizarre, to be honest. And Jack touched on that, the isolation of people living in the West Bank. We really got a sense that something was happening, and people were looking to us, going, what's going on? And it was increasingly, as we got nearer to the time when we had to leave, that we knew it was time to go. So yeah, I mean, I know that from people I still stay in contact with, things like lockdown aren't particularly new, like having to stay at home, the restrictions on Palestinians, this isn't entirely new. But obviously this is an unprecedented situation. And having visited Gaza a few years ago now in 2017, I can only imagine what that would be like for them living there, and the fear of coronavirus on the outside, perhaps.
Okay, thanks for that. And as well as the COVID-19 crisis, you also mentioned, I think, certainly in one of the presentations, about the destruction of the harvest, particularly the destruction of olive trees. How much of that's actually going on? There's a question here asking about the daily destruction of olive trees just before the harvest. What's the situation on the ground at the present moment?
So in the absence of us being able to accompany people as they olive harvest, we are running an advocacy campaign as EAPPI through the World Council of Churches and through our different national coordinated offices. And I encourage you to look that up. We are trying to maintain as much contact with people on the ground as the situation is happening. And as I'm speaking to you right now, I've received 2 notifications of settler harassment of olive harvesters that have happened today. And so we're really seeing an intense amount of cases. Since the beginning of this year, we have had almost 3,000 olive trees destroyed leading up to the olive harvest. And we expect that to intensify over the next upcoming weeks. I think in total we've had around 600 people impacted by this destruction of olive trees. Last year, there were 6,800 olive trees that were destroyed as well. And so we're very concerned that with the absence of international protective presence, that this is likely to increase. And updates about this will be posted through the World Council of Churches or the different national coordinated offices. So I encourage you to see our fact sheet that's available there. There's going to be a webinar and more information.
Thanks for that. You know, and just one supplementary, you know, that's being asked there about, does the so-called peace accord with the United Arab Emirates, you know, is that a game changer in any sense of the word, or is that, you know, how do you interpret that as an accompanier? Maybe Jack first and then Matt.
That's a very big question, because there's lots of different political influences to why that peace accord is, well, so-called peace accord has taken place. First of all, I think it's rather easy to sort of make peace, or at least normalize relations with countries that you don't really have conflict with. It's the first point. The second thing is, we believe it to be sort of a saving face move because of the failure to reach failure to annex the territories due to largely international pressure. It's a game changer perhaps for a few reasons. One is that it might cause other countries that had previously in the past boycotted any type of relations with Israel to engage again. It might be detrimental for the boycott, divestment and sanction movement that have attempted to advocate for countries to sanction Israel. So that might be a major game changer. And I think it's a major game changer for the Palestinian Authority, because so far their strategy, or lack of, has sort of assumed that this situation is going to continue the way it is. Now this change should, and I hope it does, force them to reassess the way that they're going to engage with their advocacy and with their attempts to deal with the occupation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jack. Just in 10 seconds, Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that also that, as I said in my presentation, the effects of the de facto annexation are still happening right now. And regardless of whether there's a formal annexation coming anytime soon, things are happening on the ground as we speak. So yeah, it's very important.
Okay, here's a question that's probably for me as the moderator. What is the position of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland with regard to the boycotts, disinvestment and sanctions campaign? And that's simply to say that CTBI is a collection, is a family of churches from lots of different traditions with lots of different beliefs. There is no common position on Israel-Palestine across the British and Irish churches. And what we seek to do is to give voice to lots of different programs and so on, as we are tonight. And, you know, we continue to offer opportunities to people to have voice across the spectrum of opinions. Just another question, you know, that someone's asking about how we can respond as on an individual or as on a kind of local church level. You know, we've seen tremendous reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and that's where people are taking on individual acts of solidarity. Can we do that here, you know, in this situation of accompanying people in Israel-Palestine? Start with Matt.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, that is such an important question. And it's literally why we do these presentations as ecumenical accompaniers, because it's incredibly important. At the same time, we are in a global, unprecedented pandemic. Well, I know how difficult it is for political advocacy at this time, but it doesn't mean that we can't try every means possible. It's about contacting our local elected representatives, find out who they are, find out their position on Israel-Palestine, and follow the campaigns of the EAPPI. The No to Annexation campaign was a very effective global campaign that united lots of people against the annexation. I believe that the Harvest campaign will do a similar thing. But there is a role for everyone to play. And I know how difficult it is at the moment in the political environment. But yes, all those things, and using the media, following local Israeli and Palestinian peace groups to find out what's going on, things like that.
Okay, thanks. Jack, how do you feel about individual responses and how we can be in solidarity?
I think it's absolutely key to helping build the blocks to change the situation here. But I'm rather cautious as a Palestinian of giving any sense of marching orders or suggestions to contexts that I'm not necessarily very familiar with, which is why I'm happy Matt went first. But I do think that this is a situation that always requires continuous engagement, and that there are plenty of Palestinian and international partners, and Israeli of course, on the ground who are willing to assist individuals with their sort of journey of figuring out how and what they want to do, whether that's providing information, advice, or support. So I would encourage anyone who's considering to further their activity in this issue to do so, and know that that will mean a lot to people like myself and Taysir and other Palestinians who are living in the heart of the situation here.
Good. Okay. And this is a question that really builds on that response that you've just given by asking how hopeful can we be of the growing anti-settlement movement within Israel changing the political situation?
Sorry, may I answer this?
Yes, of course. Please. Sorry.
I think that there's a false assumption in the question. I don't think that there's an anti-settlement sentiment in Israeli society. I think that polling shows the exact opposite, that Israelis are increasingly becoming supportive of the settlement project. There are strong voices still against it, but those are shrinking. So all polling data suggests that over the past decade, the settlements the support of settlements has increased. So unfortunately, I'm not hopeful from that angle.
Okay, Matt, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, Jack obviously has eyes and ears much closer to the ground than I do, but from my experience, having spoken to a breadth of opinions inside Israeli society, there is a left wing. There are peace movements. All these things exist. Yes, there is a shrinking civil society, a shrinking space for civil society in Israel, but it exists, and we need to support the local peace organisations and take note of the protests that are happening in Israel at the moment.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time. I just want to say something, I mean, two excellent presentations. A lot of people will be thinking about the possibility of being an accompanier. Jack first, what's it looking like for 2020? Particularly, we're being asked about those who signed up and were given places. I mean, I should also say, and maybe you want to comment on this, Jack, that EAPPI, of course, it is an international program through the World Council of Churches. There are people from many countries around the world, and part of the experience, I'm sure Matt can comment on this, is that you meet lots of people from different countries. Where are we as we move forward? Will the people who signed up for this last round of accompanying, will they get picked up and then get people back into into applying? What's the story?
So from the Jerusalem office, we're not involved at all in the recruitment decision making when it comes to ecumenical accompaniers, and so that's probably best to refer to the Quakers. Who are responsible. However, we do need accompaniers, and so anyone who's still willing and still wants to come, as far as the Jerusalem office is concerned, we will need people available the minute that is made possible.
Yeah, so the minute that the COVID allows accompaniers to get back, and that there are international travel and so on is allowed, then that's when we need people back on the ground. That's good. Matt, you know, what about you? You know, just say a word about your own experience, you know, of being an accompanier, and what you feel it's given to you as a person, as well as the, you know, the wider political situation.
Thank you very much. I mean, yeah, absolutely. The experience of ecumenical accompaniers is, you know, and the stories that we then tell is, you know, is crucial to the role. For me, it was an incredibly rich, interesting, and really thorough, I'd say, experience of what it is like to be in Israel and to live in the West Bank and to live under military occupation. I think for me, the crucial thing, the most interesting thing, was getting to meet so many different people. So many people with political views that I was really surprised at the variety. It's not, as Jack says, just Israel versus Palestine or anything like that. There's a lot of people in this situation who want to say things and, you know, have their own thoughts and opinions. For me, it was moving beyond academia. It was moving beyond the charity work that I'd previously done. It was beyond the news and the media and things like that. It was getting to know real people, their lives, and then having a role to play, as I do now, to be able to tell their stories to you guys like this.
And of course, I think one of the things, you know, that when you do speak to Palestinians, they say, you know, when you're able, please do come on a pilgrimage, you know, come and stay with us. Don't just be a tourist walking through, come and stay and actually share with us and listen, as well as you know, offer things, you know. And I think that's really important, that that local congregations and dioceses and synods and so on actually pick that message up, you know, that Palestinians also need financial support through their products, through all the things, you know, that are going on all the time. But your presence is always, and your prayers is always very much part of that. Linda from the Quakers says, yes, we are in touch with all who offered to serve as EAs in 2020, and they will get out sometime. When that sometime is, of course, you know, none of us can say. It's now just after 8 o'clock, and it's time for us to wind up the webinar. I'm sorry, there have been a number of questions that we haven't been able to get to. My apologies that we haven't been able to get into them. Some of them are huge questions. It would have taken over the whole webinar, you know, and maybe that's something that we should think about for another evening. I just want to say thanks to Jack and to Matt for 2 brilliant presentations. This presentation has been recorded. I'm sure it will be shown in a number of other places and used by the Quakers. One final word, and that's to say how much CTBI appreciates the partnership that we have with the Quakers in Britain on the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. That's a programme that we will continue to support, and we look forward to deepening our partnership. So thanks to everyone who has participated. Thanks to Jack, thanks to Matt, thanks to all of you who have been on the call this evening. Have a good evening and stay safe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.